Welcome to Ner Reglai Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. And just to remind everyone, our name, the name of this organization, Ner Reglai, comes from Psalm 119, 105, where it says, "Your word is a lamp unto my feet." So Ner Reglai is lamp to my feet. And that's why we're here, is to study God's word, so that may light our way and guide us in our lives with his truth. So we want to continue in the book of Daniel. We're starting Daniel chapter 5 tonight. And I've titled this teaching, this is Daniel 5 part 1, and it is titled Wine versus Wisdom. And I think we'll see the understanding of that as we go through this chapter. So wine versus wisdom. Now, as we leave Daniel chapter 4, we remember that we read the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar, but that's the last we see of Nebuchadnezzar, right? We don't see him anymore in the book of Daniel. And as we enter into Daniel chapter 5, we're introduced to a new king, Belshazzar. And that's what we read here in Daniel 5:1. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. So who is this king Belshazzar? Now, the name Belshazzar comes from the Babylonian or Akkadian Belshazzar, and it means Bel, protect the king. As we've been going through these different Babylonian names, right? They're all dealing with these various gods from Babylon. Now, Belshazzar is a very interesting king, and he has a very mysterious reign. And we're going to start with understanding who this king is and, his reign as a king. So to understand the identity of King Belshazzar, it's helpful to understand the kings of Babylon in their succession. So who were the kings of Babylon during the time of the exile of the Jews to Babylon? We're all familiar with Nebuchadnezzar. He kind of dominates the scene. He's also that figure, the head of gold, right, in that image in Daniel 2. He represents the kingdom in many ways. But who were the other kings? And was Belshazzar one of the Babylonian kings? So we want to go into this short history lesson of the kings of Babylon. Now, I emphasize it's during the Neo-Babylonian Empire, right? The new Babylonian Empire from 626 to 539 BCE. That's the general time frame we're looking at. Now, we know from our previous studies, Nabopolassar was the first king of this new kingdom, and he basically would reign from 627 to 605 BCE. He's the father of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we call Nebuchadnezzar II because of a previous king hundreds of years before him who had the same name. So just to differentiate these two kings, they call the Nebuchadnezzar that we're all familiar with in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar II. You'll see that in academic writings. And he reigned from 605 to 562 BCE. We're all familiar with these names and numbers so far. Now, his son, Nebuchadnezzar's son, Evil-Merodach, or Amel Marduk, he reigned for 2 years from 562 to 560 BCE. And it's interesting how this king is written about in the Bible in a couple different places, in 2 Kings and Jeremiah. And he showed mercy to the king, to King Jehoiachin, who was a prisoner in Babylon, right? So the former king of Jerusalem, King Jehoiachin, who was a prisoner, he showed mercy to him. We're going to read the verses here in Jeremiah 52, just to see that, see this in context. So Jeremiah 52, starting in verse 31, says, "Now it came about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th of the month, that Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, showed favor to Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him out of prison. Then he spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the thrones of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin changed his prison clothes and had his meals in the king's presence regularly all the days of his life. For his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king of Babylon, a daily portion all the days of his life until the day of his death." Okay, so King Jehoiachin of Judah, of Jerusalem, right? He was exiled in 597, along with a large delegation from Jerusalem that were taken to Babylon, right? So he was in prison for all these years, but then he was released in 561 BCE. Now, he wasn't released to go back to Jerusalem. He was simply set free from the confinement of prison and was able to live freely in Babylon. Now, this is actually a good example of the fulfillment of prophecy that we read about in Jeremiah 24. I'm not going to read it again, right? But God said basically, listen, there's a blessing. He actually compared the people to figs. The good figs were those who submitted to King Nebuchadnezzar and went to Babylon. The bad figs, the bad people, were the ones who rebelled and stayed in Jerusalem. God had set a time for the people to be exiled, and they needed to submit to it. Submit to God and submit to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, there was a blessing in that submission, and that's what we see in Jehoiachin's life. He submitted, he went, he was in prison for these years, but then he was set free, and he still had his life. So there is a blessing in understanding what God is saying, even when life is difficult, right? So evil Merodach was, unfortunately, had a short life. He was killed by Neri-Glisar in 560 BCE. So he's our next king, our fourth king, right, of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He also has another name, Nergal-Sharezer. We actually have seen him in different scriptures we've looked at in the past teachings. He reigned from 560 to 556 BCE. This man, Nergal-Sharezer, was a high official in Nebuchadnezzar's military, and he married the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And then after his reign, we have Labashi-Marduk, who is the son of this Nergal-Sharezer, or Neri-Glisar, and he reigned for 2 months in the year 556 BCE. Very short reign, because he was assassinated by Nabonidus. Right, and now this king Nabonidus is actually a very important king, and he reigned from 556 to 539 BCE, which is the end of the Babylonian Empire. Now, Nabonidus, his name originally, the Akkadian or Babylonian, is Nabunaid, and it means Nabu is praised or revered, right? So again, we see the same root of like Nebuchadnezzar, Nabu, right? So it's putting that Babylonian god name in there. Now, Nabonidus was the son of a high priestess of the moon god Sin at Haran. Nabonidus married Nitocris, the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and he spent most of his time and energy restoring 3 different temples in the Babylonian kingdom. Nabonidus is considered the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Now, when we read about the kings of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, there are actually historical records of the kings. We generally see them in this manner, with starting from Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar, Amel-Marduk, Neri-Glisar, Labashi-Marduk, and Nabonidus. So these are generally the kings, and Nabonidus is the last king. So if the Babylonian Empire ended in 539 BCE, when Cyrus came in, where is Belshazzar? Was Belshazzar a legitimate king? So until the 20th century, meaning just 100 years ago, Belshazzar was unknown as a king in Babylon apart from the Bible. Did Belshazzar really reign as king? Thankfully, amazing archaeological discoveries were made in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it's worth reviewing history to see how the facts come together to support Daniel 5 and to support the Bible. So first of all, we have something called the Nabonidus Chronicle, right? You see it there in the picture to the right, and this records an account of King Nabonidus and how he spent his years as king. It explains how Nabonidus was absent from Babylon for 10 years while he was in Arabia. Okay, that's nice. So what about Belshazzar? Did Belshazzar really reign as king? Where is Belshazzar in the historical record? Is there any record of this Belshazzar? Thankfully, we found this cylinder called the Nabonidus cylinder from Ur, right? And it's actually one of 4 cylinders found at Ur during excavations by J.G. Taylor in 1854. There's a total of 5 cylinders, which we'll read about in a minute, but 4 at this one particular location. And here we read about a little bit of the history of the Nabonidus cylinders from Ur. So I'm going to read this quote for the next several slides. The cylinders of Nabonidus refer to cuneiform texts inscribed on 5 cylinders that are classified as foundation texts because they were found in the foundation of buildings of a temple complex. The main purpose of these foundation cylinders was to record Nabonidus' work of repairing and rebuilding the temple complexes during his reign. British official and archaeologist J.G. Taylor excavated a ziggurat at Ur called E. Lugal Galgasisa of the Temple of Sin complex and found 4 identical cuneiform cylinders in 1854. In a seeming contradiction to the biblical record, ancient Babylonian king lists appear to indicate that Nabonidus was its last king. The name Belshazzar is absent. The book of Daniel indicates that Belshazzar was Babylon's last king, as we know in Daniel 5. These cylinders from Ur are significant because they mention Nabonidus' son Belshazzar, and subsequent findings prove that Belshazzar was indeed the last king of Babylon. Okay, so this cylinder here is a very important find, and I want to read a section, a part of this cylinder, which is translated into English. So this is a direct quote from the Nabonidus cylinder from Ur, and it says this. And it's basically it's a prayer of Nabonidus to his God. It says, "As for me, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, save me from sinning against your great Godhead and grant me as a present a life long of days. And as for Belshazzar, the eldest son, my offspring, instill reverence for your great Godhead in his heart, and may he not commit any cultic mistake. May he be sated with a life of plenitude." This is the famous quote. It mentions Belshazzar by name and verifies he was a real person, and it confirms the text of the Bible in Daniel 5. So this is it's an amazing find and confirming the accuracy of the Bible. Until the finding of this cuneiform cylinder in 1854, King Belshazzar was only mentioned in the Bible, and most people thought the Bible was mistaken. All of these supposed scholars, right? These cylinders were deciphered in the 1920s, revealing the name Belshazzar. Today, King Belshazzar's existence is indisputable and accepted by all scholars. The veracity of the Bible is proven accurate once again. So it's a very important find. Now, putting all of these facts together, Belshazzar was the eldest son of Nabonidus and Nitocris, the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar was most likely a co-regent with his father Nabonidus, while Nabonidus was away from Babylon. This took place, meaning that Belshazzar became king in the 3rd year of Nabonidus' reign, which would have been 553 BCE. Therefore, Belshazzar reigned from 553 until 539 BCE, paralleling the reign of his father, right? His father started 3 years earlier, but then they basically had a co-regency, right? They were both kings at the same time because Belshazzar was in the kingdom and Nabonidus was spending most of his time outside of the kingdom. So he had a king in the kingdom. So then the question is often asked, was Belshazzar related to Nebuchadnezzar? Because in Daniel 5, the queen, which we'll read about later, but the queen refers to Belshazzar as the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And we see the verse here in Daniel 5:11. She mentions Nebuchadnezzar as the father of Belshazzar. So I have asked the question here at the bottom of the screen, if Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, why is he also called the son of Nebuchadnezzar? Why is Nebuchadnezzar called his father? So this is a good question. And again, as I've mentioned many times, context is king, right? We need to understand the context. And it's also a good example of why we study the Bible from a Jewish, historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective, right? We have We have to put all of the pieces together. So first of all, there is no word for grandfather or grandson in Aramaic or Hebrew. Now, when I say Aramaic or Hebrew, I'm talking about ancient or biblical, because in modern Hebrew, we do have a word for a grandson and a grandfather, but we're talking about biblical Hebrew. There was no word for grandfather or grandson. The words av and ben mean father and son, and they can also mean ancestor or descendant, and they're used throughout the scriptures like this. It's very common. So Belshazzar is referred to as a son of Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadnezzar as his father, because he's considered a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, not a literal son, right? So this is a very, when you're translating and you say father or son, we often think of it in the immediate, right, one generation, but it could be 10 generations. And that's what we're seeing here, that Belshazzar was a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar through Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, but not a direct son. We know that Belshazzar was actively reigning as king in Babylon while Nabonidus was somewhere outside the kingdom. Belshazzar and Nabonidus both reigned as king or kings of Babylon simultaneously for several years. Now, just understanding the context of Daniel chapter 5, it was 539 BCE, and the date was the 11th or 12th of October. It was recorded as the 16th of Tishri. And how do we know this? From historical records that detail the fall of Babylon on the 16th of Tishri, 539 BCE, from the Nabonidus Chronicle. So we actually know the very date, and all of Daniel chapter 5 occurs within a 24-hour period. So it's all within this period. So we know exactly when this was. Okay, now just to kind of take a step back and understand where we're at in the book of Daniel, right? We've come from Daniel chapter 1 to Daniel chapter 5, and Daniel chapter 1 begins in 605 BCE, and Daniel chapter 5 is in 539 BCE. 66 years have passed, right, from Daniel chapter 1. Daniel and his friends were children when they came into the kingdom. They were maybe 12 or at the max 15 years old. Now, 4 chapters later, they are old men, if they're even still alive. We know Daniel is 66 years later. Just from chapter 4 to chapter 5, we have a 23-year gap, at least, right? Why do we know that? Because in chapter 4, it's Nebuchadnezzar was alive. He died in 562. It's now 539, right? So 23 years have passed, at least. It could have been 30 years. But just to say, at least 23 years have passed. Time is going quickly here. And the rest of the book of Daniel actually stays within a small amount of time. So many years have passed. Daniel was approximately 80 years old as we come to Daniel chapter 5. And just to understand as well, on the global scale, you have Persia as an empire that is rising. Cyrus the Great is also rising as a leader. The Medes and Persians were literally at the front gate of the city of Babylon in Daniel chapter 5. In the days and weeks leading up to the account in Daniel chapter 5, Nabonidus went out to meet Cyrus with his army, but was defeated. Nabonidus fled to Barseba, another city in Babylonia, but eventually surrendered to Cyrus. His life was spared, but he was banned from entering Babylon. So you have to understand, all the surrounding territory of the city of Babylon had already been captured by the Medes and the Persians. The Persians and Medes, under the rule of Cyrus, had surrounded the city of Babylon. When we read Daniel 5:1, Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. So natural question, hopefully you're all thinking of it, why would Belshazzar have a feast during a siege of the city of which he was king? So I think the best answer is pride and arrogance. Belshazzar thought that the great city walls could not be breached. And listen, as we understand the history of this city and the way it was built, they were strong and high and fortified, double walls. No one could breach them. And he had a kind of a good earthly reason to believe this. It is also said that they had food stored in the city of Babylon for up to 20 years. The Euphrates River ran through the city, providing fresh water. Belshazzar had every human reason to feel secure, and he was also trusting in his gods. He had security, he had food, and he had water, and he had all of his subjects inside this fortified city. But he was also trusting in his gods. So let's continue with the text of Daniel chapter 5 to see how the story progresses. Again, we see this title worked out, wine versus wisdom. So verse 2, while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines could drink out of them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank out of them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Okay, so Belshazzar had this great feast. And here we see an image of a large gathering, which is very royal. But I don't think Belshazzar's feast looked exactly like this. Probably was not quite as orderly. It was probably not a formal affair, but rather it was a wine feast or a wine fest. From the context that we read in Daniel chapter 5, it really shows more of a party that was focused on the wine. Now, just to clarify here, wine is not evil. It is a blessing given to man. And as we read here in Psalm 104, God speaks of it in a very positive and good way. And it says this regarding the works of God in Psalm 104, beginning in verse 13. He waters the mountains from his upper chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of his works. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle and vegetation for the labor of man, so that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine which makes man's heart glad, so that he may make his face glisten with oil, and food which sustains man's heart. So wine is something that is a blessing giving to make us glad. Now Belshazzar and his guests abused the blessing of wine, and they were going a little bit farther. Belshazzar ordered the gold and silver vessels from the Jerusalem temple to be brought in to be used by his guests, right? Belshazzar and his guests drank from the holy vessels of the Jerusalem temple that are dedicated to the God of heaven, and worshiped other gods, gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. This is not coincidence. He's bringing judgment upon himself. And just as the vessels of the temple came into Babylon 66 years earlier, they were now about to be brought back as this judgment ensued. So why did they specifically drink to these certain materials, right? Gold and silver, wood and stone. They worshiped the created instead of the creator. Now, it's interesting, there are 6 elements listed here, and some commentators point out the number 6 representing man and this world, as they worship the things of this world, excluding the God of creation. When people do not worship the God of heaven, they will worship idols of this world. This is a universal principle, and we see it everywhere around the world. And interestingly, we see similar idolatry of these elements, right, of these materials in the Great Tribulation at the end times, all except for iron. Iron's the only one missing here. But we read this in Revelation chapter 9, verses 20 and 21. The rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, so as not to worship demons and the idols of gold and of silver and of brass and of stone and of wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk, and they did not repent of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their immorality, nor of their thefts. So in the end times, people will act in a similar manner as Belshazzar and his nobles did in ancient Babylon by worshiping creation instead of the creator. Technology may have changed since 2,600 years ago, but evil still reveals itself in a similar manner. And again, we see all of these parallels, right, to the ancient Babylon, to what will happen in the end times. And again, that's why it's called, that's why Babylon is the symbolic kingdom, right? We've talked about this before. So let's continue in Daniel chapter 5, continuing in verse 5. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face became pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints loosened, and his knees began knocking together. The king called aloud to bring in the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king began speaking and said to the wise men of Babylon, anyone who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. The king called Belshazzar. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even more pale, and his nobles were perplexed. Okay, so here we have the story of the writing on the wall. And we read the first word there in verse 5 was suddenly. It's actually in in Aramaic, it's the phrase bashata, which literally means in that hour or at that moment. But it's more like in that hour. It seems to indicate that very little time passed between the bringing in of the holy vessels of the Jerusalem temple to the feast and the appearing of the hand. In that same hour, right? So when they brought in those vessels and started using them, in that same hour, the hand started writing on the wall. The king was shaking, literally shaking, and we read in verse 6, the king's face became pale, his thoughts alarmed him, his hip joints loosened, and his knees began knocking together. And it says that the writing on the wall occurred opposite the lampstand so that it would have been illuminated in clear sight to everyone, right? This is nighttime, it's evening, it's a party, but the writing on the wall with the finger and the hand happened opposite the lampstand so everyone could see it. The king promised that the one able to read and interpret the inscription amongst the wise men, right, would be given the glory of men, gold, fine linen, and power as the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, this position of authority as a third ruler in the kingdom confirms the status of Belshazzar as the second king, reigning together with his father, right, as the first king. So they had first and second place. And then the person who was able to read and interpret this would be called the third ruler in the kingdom. Then we read in verse 8 that all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Why could they not read the inscription? It seems that the inscription was in Aramaic, as we see later in the text, but for some reason they could not read it. Belshazzar and his wise men were lost, and they did not know where to turn. We literally read this in the text. All of his nobles did not know what to do. And what happens when men are lost? A wise woman must step in, right? We see this often in the Bible. When men fail to lead, a woman will lead them. Women usually always know what's going on and kind of what to do. They're kind of waiting for the man to take the next step. But when men fail to lead, a woman is always there to rise up and take action. Now, I just want to give a short example of this. In the story of Deborah and Barak, right? Now, Deborah was a prophetess. God gave her a word for Barak to go and fight a certain battle. And his response was to her, as we read here in Judges 4:8, then Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. She said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. So Barak failed to lead, right? So a woman would lead them. and get the credit. Belshazzar failed to lead. His wise men were not able to actually do their job either. And we see a similar fate here in Daniel 5. A wise woman steps in. Verse 10, the queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen began to speak and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination and insight and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the soothsayer, priests, sorcerers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of riddles, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. Okay, so who is this wise queen? The wives and concubines of King Belshazzar were already at the feast. That's what we read in the text. It's commonly understood that this queen is either his mother or his grandmother. It's either Nebuchadnezzar's daughter or Nebuchadnezzar's widow. So obviously, she obviously knew Daniel's wisdom and his ability to solve difficult riddles in life, as she explained. She proclaimed that Daniel had the spirit of the holy gods in him, and that he had what is written in Aramaic, Ruach Yatira, an extraordinary spirit. This is quite a compliment. It was a testimony to the Spirit of God working through Daniel. She also explained how Daniel could interpret dreams, explain riddles, solve difficult problems. And the solving difficult problems is literally loosening knots, right, or difficulties. It was an extraordinary list of compliments stating that Daniel possessed all of these things: a spirit of the holy gods, illumination, insight, knowledge, wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods. She told Belshazzar that Nebuchadnezzar, his forefather, made Daniel chief of the wise men. And she advised Belshazzar to be wise and call on a truly wise man, Daniel the prophet. So here I think we see the clear contrast, right, of wine versus wisdom. The wine and idolatry of King Belshazzar versus the wisdom and extraordinary spirit of Daniel the prophet. There were certain things that characterized the one man and certain things that characterized the other man. Daniel was approximately 80 years old when we're reading this here in Daniel 5. Daniel's spiritual legacy was well established in the kingdom of Babylon. Daniel the prophet had a defining legacy in a foreign kingdom, which left a powerful impression upon the queen mother and certainly others. The Spirit of God, the power of God, and divine wisdom marked Daniel's life. So as we come to the end of this lesson, I want us to reflect on this question of legacy, right? Is your life marked by the power, the Spirit, and the wisdom of God? How do others speak of you today? Do they speak of you of an idolater and a drinker of wine, or as a wise and godly person? What kind of legacy will you leave behind? We all need to think about these questions and to consider the impact we're making today and the impact that we will leave behind. Wine versus wisdom. I think we see a clear contrast there between the two lives, and we want to bring this lesson to an end for today. I want to thank you all for joining. Please read chapter 5 again for the next teaching. And again, if you are benefiting from these teachings, we want to encourage you to support our ministry, Nela Reglai, by clicking the Give tab. Thank you, and see you next time.